As the financial crisis eases its grip on Europe, the continent is now faced with a different challenge. It's claimed bribery is eating the union from the inside, reportedly costing the bloc as much as it spends in a whole year. Can the world's most advanced economies handle the shocking truth? Who'll stamp on the grabbing hands? Or is the fight against corruption hopeless?
Mr. Kos, it's great to have you with us today. Now, the commissioner behind the report into the corruption in the EU has called the scale of it breathtaking. Do the figures take your breath away? Because they're certainly striking.
Well, first of all, best regards to your viewers all around the world. I must say I was not so much surprised about the figures which were presented in the report. Although they are estimation, but still I would say that the estimation is quite accurate. And if you take into consideration that the amount of money which is being spent every year in the European Union, those figures are extremely big, but not such a surprise.
But I mean, we are talking about 120 billion euros, which is approximately the budget of EU. It is a huge number, though.
Yeah, well, but you have to take into consideration that, let's say, just 3 years ago, the European Union was spending several hundred billion of euros on the public procurement. And there are estimations that in each public procurement deal, 20, 30, sometimes even 50% of the money is spent on corruption. So this figure is, I think, as I said, I think it's quite accurate. Of course, this figure has to cause an alarm with all the decision makers in all countries of the European Union, which until now was obviously convinced that the corruption is not such a big problem. Obviously it is. And obviously, it is the time has come to do something against it.
But why were they so surprised to see this number? I mean, the lady behind the report was obviously expressing her shock.
This is the first report which gives the general overview of the events in the corruption or anti-corruption area in the European Union. Until today, we were just dealing with national reports concerning concrete countries. And since this is the first one on the European Union level, of course, the figures which are shown there are shocking for somebody, especially for those who did not even think that corruption might be such a big problem. And, you know, if you don't think that corruption is a big problem, you have no political reason to deal with it. So today it is obvious, it is clear, corruption is a huge problem. Through corruption, we are wasting billions and billions of our taxpayers' money, and this also means that our politicians will have to do something against it.
So, Mr. Kos, when we're talking about corruption, can you explain to us what forms it takes? Are we talking about bribery only, money laundering, organized crime?
Well, basically, we make a difference between, we call it petty corruption, low-level corruption, and high-level corruption. Petty corruption is the bribes our, let's say, citizens all over the world are paying to the police officers, to customs officers, to public officials at their, let's say, local communities. And the damage caused with petty corruption is not such big as the other one, the damage caused by high-level corruption, which is conducted by the politicians in power. They don't do it very often, but when they do it, we are speaking about hundreds, sometimes, let's say, yeah, about millions and millions of dollars or euros of damage caused. And what is even more important, the consequences of corruption are also corrupt decisions, which influence the life of each of us.
Now, when you're talking about the government officials actually being involved in large-scale corruption schemes, can you give us a precise example?
Well, you see, also in European Union, we are dealing with public officials from the lowest level. Let's say those are police officers, tax officers, customs officers, but also we are also dealing with presidents of the governments.
Yeah, what I'm asking about the presidents and the government.
In my own country, we have a case. Yeah, we have, let's say, a case in my country where the ex-president of the government, the prime minister, has been sentenced, although the sentence is not final yet, for some sort of bribery. So there is nobody is immune from corruption, and the politicians at the top can cause the most of the damage, and this is the most dangerous form of corruption.
Mm-hmm. But if you look at it from to generalize, like, who would you say is the biggest offender, the businessmen or the government, the officials?
Well, it depends in which way it happens. You know, not so long ago, people were saying the one who is giving bribes is less guilty than the one who is accepting bribes. This is not the true, you know. The one who is giving is equally guilty as the one who is accepting bribes. What is important is what position persons involved in corruption have. So if you're dealing with the, let's say, with the director of a private company who's bribing a high-level official at the level of, let's say, minister or even the prime minister, then of course the one who is having much more powers are the ministers and prime ministers, and of course they have to be burdened more with what is happening, and because they can cause, and they are causing much more damage than ordinary directors of ordinary companies.
But among countries themselves, like, who are the worst offenders and why those countries especially, if you know?
Well, in this European report, countries like Spain, Italy, Greece have been exposed as the most corrupt countries in the European Union. There are different reasons for that. First of all, those are all countries which are facing serious economic crisis. Then, as much I usually don't want to speak about it, but it sometimes, I have to admit that it is also part of the culture of those countries. And the third one is the anti-corruption systems in those countries are not effective. They do not work. And therefore, there is no threat for the guys who are already involved in corruption or they are planning to get involved in corruption, because they know they can do whatever they want to. They will not be punished by the state. And this is the consequences we see.
But you bring up an interesting point. You're saying it's part of the culture. But if it's part of a culture, how do you fight it?
Well, cultures can also be changed. I can remember one of my presentations some years ago in your country, in Russian Federation, where one of the professors at one of the faculty was trying to explain to students that corruption is in the culture of Russians and nothing can be done to fight it. I do not agree with that one, you know. This was maybe happening in the past, but also cultures are developing. And if nowadays it is obvious and it is clear, or at least it should be clear, that corruption is something which is undermining the life of each of us, then it cannot be part of anybody's culture. Of course, it takes years, sometimes it takes decades, sometimes it takes centuries, but I'm quite sure that at the end, also those cultures will change. Let's take, for example, Scandinavian countries. They have maybe half of the legislation we have. They have 1/3 of the institutions we have, and they almost have no corruption. Why? Because culturally, it is a disaster for somebody in Finland, Sweden, and Norway to be even suspicious of being involved in corruption. And of course, I'm not saying that they don't have corrupt individuals there, but the extent of corruption there is much lower than let's say, in other countries, especially countries in Southern Europe.
Well, exactly. Would you say that EU enlargement is creating more corruption problems? When the new member states, like from Eastern Europe, join, for example, with their more relaxed attitude towards corruption, is that a big problem as a whole?
No, I think the problem is somewhere else. You see, when countries are acceding to the European Union is imposing a lot of pressure on them to fight corruption. Effective fight against corruption is even political criteria for countries to join the EU. That means it is non-negotiable. They have to do it. But what happens afterwards is the problem. You see, all the countries I know which have joined the EU were at the peak of their anti-corruption efforts on the day of the accession. The next day, the European Union was not pushing, pressing them. They started to become very lenient on the fight against corruption. And we saw cases like, let's say, my own country, we saw cases like Bulgaria and Romania, where just a year or two after the accession, the situation much worse than before the accession process. So it is obvious that there was no genuine political will in those countries to fight corruption, but they were doing it just because they had to do it, because they were under the pressure of the European Union.
But also for some immigrants, bribing an official can be the only way to stay alive or stay in Europe. Is this making the EU's corruption problem even worse?
Well, in law we have, of course, there are situations where nobody can have any questions about the fact that somebody has given the bribe. if you're speaking about staying alive, if you're speaking about, let's say, keeping the job, if you're speaking about getting the job, and those people are being blackmailed by the ones who are accepting bribes, of course, formally this is still corruption, formally this is still giving bribes. But in the legal system, there are so many defenses which would enable those individuals not to get punished, or at least not to get punished as seriously as if that would not be the case.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're going to take a short break now. After the break, can corruption be fought by legalizing it? And we'll be back with Drago Kos, head of the OECD Working Group on Bribery. We're back with Drago Kos, a professional corruption fighter. It's good to have you back in the studio. So you were saying in the first part of our program that, for example, Bulgaria and Romania, once they were entering the EU, they were at the peak of fighting the corruption, and as soon as they became members of the EU, they became very lenient. This is something that the EU high officials haven't envisaged, from what I understand. So do you guys have now mechanisms to fight that once they're in, but they're not being lenient, but they're being lenient to fight corruption? What do you do with that?
You see, after the case of Romania and Bulgaria, where the difference was so huge between the days before the accession and the day after the accession, the European Commission has developed a system which is called Cooperation and Verification Mechanism, which was basically, again, assessing what those two countries are doing in the fight against corruption. And since they were not fulfilling the criteria set by those mechanisms, they were losing hundreds of millions of euros because the European Commission has frozen the funds which were intended for those two countries because they were not fighting corruption. If you take case of Croatia, who joined, let's say, the later stage, their European Commission was much more careful. They were simply asking Croatia to investigate some concrete cases of corruption as a proof, as an evidence that they will really fight corruption. And Croatia was forced to do it. And I must say, I expect this to happen with all future candidates. So on the day of the accession, it will not be over. On the day of the accession, it will not mean the end of the fight against corruption, but it will be just one of the phases which will have to be confirmed also afterwards.
So when you're comparing countries like Greece and Spain, which are at its peak of corruption schemes at this point, and then you had Bulgaria and Romania that were at its peak 5 years ago, how different are the corruption schemes in those countries if you compare, or are they all the same?
Well, basically, corruption schemes are the same, but there's a huge difference. You see, the new European member states are, despite the fact that they're still having a lot of problems in the fight against corruption, they're closing the gap between them and between the old EU member states. You see, there was, and I'm afraid there still is, so-called, they exist so-called double standards. For the old EU member states, there's not so many mechanisms which European Commission is applying as they are applying them towards the new European member states. So there are different standards. If you are an old European member states, you can do a lot in the wrong way, and you will not get even warned by the European Commission. If you are a new one, you will soon face warnings, and as I said, in the case of Romania and Bulgaria, also very practical consequences in the form of frozen European funds, and so on and so on.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've been tackling corruption in Europe for decades. You come from the part of the world, and from Eastern Europe, where you understand that corruption is, in some ways, part of the political culture. What are the most alarming examples of corruption on the continent that you personally have come across?
Well, I think the most alarming form of corruption is when politicians winning the elections, they think that the state in which they have won has become their let's say, reward for their election. With other words, they take the winning at the election, they take it as a winning at separation of the treasures which are there. And I saw in so many countries already that the highest level of politicians were simply destroying the countries for their personal needs, because they thought they have right to do it. They thought they have right to put all their political allies on the most important positions, not only to give them jobs, but also to be sure that those political allies will serve as intermediaries in those grabbing the wealth of the countries and stealing the richness of all the countries.
Well, for instance, in the United States, corruption is practically legalized in the sense that it is called simply lobbying. It's transparent, it's regulated, and it's out of the shadows. Can legalization be an answer?
I would also say that in the States corruption is legalized. No, just have very clear and precise rules. Let's say they have rules on lobbying, they have rules on many other things, which in, let's say, at least in eastern parts of the Europe, would still be considered corruption.
Well, that's what I'm saying, like lobbying in the United States.
In the state.
Sorry, that's what I'm saying, because lobbying in the United States is something that is legal and it's completely transparent and out of the shadow. But lobbying in that form in Eastern European countries or Western European countries will be considered as corruption nowadays.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. You see, lobbying by itself, it's not corruption. No, the difference between lobbying and corruption is very simple. If you lobby, you have to convince somebody with the power of the argument. If you're corrupting somebody, you convince him or her with the power of the money. So, and if you make it transparent, as it is in the States, as it is in some other countries, let's say in Europe, also Poland has very good lobbying legislation, then of course it is much more difficult to use lobbying as a form of corruption. Countries which don't want to do it, basically lobbying is still happening, but it's happening in shadow, and it involves a lot of corruption too.
Can I ask you something? Have you or your colleagues ever been approached with bribes? Let's say, has anyone ever come up to you and said, listen, we're going to give you a bribe, Mr. Kos, and you lay off and you stop checking up on us?
Well, it happened when I was in the police many years ago. And I must say that I would not like this to happen again, because
But what do you mean happen in police? The police try to bribe you?
I was so ashamed. No, I was once a police officer.
Right.
And while I was investigating a case, one of the suspects approached me and offered me a bribe to abandon the investigation. And I must say that was, let's say, one of the worst experiences in my life. No, how can it happen to me? What did I do that he thinks that he can bribe me? And in such cases, you know, it's only a very strict reaction, very declining reaction, which helps. Otherwise, you get exposed again and again.
Mm-hmm. But you also fought corruption in the world's richest and poorest countries. What different challenges do they actually pose?
Well, first, there's a difference in the forms of corruption. If you take forms of corruption in the poorest countries of the world, it is so blatant. You can see it very easily. The only problem is there that people are almost accepting it as some sort of survival. You can see the same forms of corruption in a very sophisticated form, although also in the richest countries of the world, and they're still expressing the wish to fight it. They have the mechanisms in place, and that's why the extent of corruption there is not such a big one. But still, it happens, and when you speak to the suspects in the rich countries, basically they give you the same excuses for why they have done it, you know. I needed it for that, I needed it for that, I didn't know it's wrong. So it's basically, human nature is the same all over the place. It's just the difference how many cases we deal with and how open it is when it happens.
But I'm just trying to figure out the scale, if you compare the scale of corruption in poorer countries and richer countries. I mean, when I think about it, I'm thinking probably the corruption scale is larger in richer countries, but it's better masked than in poorer countries. What do you think?
No, not really. You see, because in poorer countries, we are dealing with many cases of so-called petty corruption, because, let's say, low-level public officials are forced to take bribes to survive. They have to feed their families. And for that, if their salary is not enough, they are forced to take bribes. And the extent of corruption there is really huge. And because they do it, the guys above them, they're doing it also. And the guys at the top, they're doing it also. Of course, the guys at the top, they steal millions. They don't take, let's say, cents or pennies. In richer countries, the extent of damage caused by one individual case of corruption, of course, is bigger. But there they don't have petty corruption. So they're dealing with high-level corruption only, which involves much more money, but the number of cases is not so big. And if it happens, it is at least, it looks that it is investigated, prosecuted, and adjudicated as it should be. And so, with other words, there is still a huge difference between rich and poor countries. But as I said before, on the case of Romania, Bulgaria, and other European Union countries, I would say the gap is closing.
And with technology becoming more and more part of our life, do you think that human factor in corruption can be minimized?
Well, not really, no, because technology can help the bad guys and technology can help the good guys. And as usually, as always happens, you know, the bad guys are always a bit some steps forward, and they're using modern technologies to, let's say, as their tools in conducting corruption offenses in a more advanced way. You know, when, let's say, the law enforcement services of countries, the police, the prosecution services, when they want to apply new technologies, first they have to have legal grounds for that, then they have to be authorized by the legislation, and then they have to be usually authorized by the judiciary. So this always takes time. And here the criminals are, let's say, having the sometimes decisive advantage because they're using new technologies even to increase their wealth and even to increase their corruption activities.
But what I meant was that could digitalizing the services help, actually?
Well, that would be one of the ways how to prevent. Yeah, that would help. Let's say in specific services, yes. If you digitalize, let's say, some services, one of the golden rules of prevention of corruption can be applied. This is so-called one-stop system. That means you don't have to go to the authorities to get different pieces of licenses. You just do it in one place. You don't even have to see the person in place who is deciding on it. And of course, this is one of the cases how this can be used as a very effective preventive measure.
Thank you very much for this interesting insight. And we were talking to Drago Kos, professional corruption fighter and head of the OECD Working Group on Bribery. It was great to have you with us.